Everyone, welcome. Welcome to this 32nd Miami Book Fair. I'm Mitchell Kaplan. On behalf of the Board of Directors and everyone involved with the Book Fair, I want to welcome you to this very special evening. I don't know how many of you were a bit earlier, but we heard Gary Snyder give a remarkable poetry reading. And tomorrow evening we'll have I think it's 27 long-listed members of the long-listed honorees of the National Book Award will all be on stage here tomorrow, including 3 of the 4 winners. So that'll be quite an event. And as I stand up here all the time, and it's probably getting old for those of you who've been here for so long, but it never gets old for me. And that's to thank Miami-Dade College for the gift of the book fair. Let's give them a big thanks. You know, the college really turns over the facilities here and does so much to make this all happen. Faculty, staff, people putting up the booths, they just sacrifice so much in the name of literature. And I just representatively, I'd like to just say that we thank the faculty and staff for all that they do. You'll see many of them here. In fact, in this room, over the weekend, Pascal Charlotte, who's the Dean of the Honors College, will be there, and Pascal is here with us as well. So we thank you, and we thank everybody else as well. Also, one of the things I want to tell you, I don't know about you, but if I gave to everybody who sent me an email today, I'd have to take my kids out of college, basically. The Give Miami Day has just been kind of remarkable, and I heard backstage that they are almost hitting their goal of $7 million given today alone. So, of course, I'm going to hit you up. It ends at midnight tonight, and if you go to givemiamiday.org, if you go and donate anywhere from $25 to $10,000 to the Read to Learn portion of the Miami Book Fair, that donation will be matched. So we're hoping that you might think of that as well. I'd also like to welcome a member of the Miami-Dade Board of Commissioners, and that's Daniela Cava-Levine, who's here with us. We thank you, and also all the members of the Board of Trustees who are here tonight as well. And to introduce our guest tonight, it's my honor to bring up somebody who's a third-generation Floridian. Andrew Corge is a businessman and entrepreneur. He works in real estate. He's part owner of a startup technology company as well. Andrew graduated from Babson College in 2003 and the Levin College of Law at the University of Florida in 2007. He's really, truly one of our next generation of millennial community leaders coming right out of Miami, who has built several organizations that engage the next generation of leaders in civics, politics, and policy. And most of you know that Andrew has announced for the state Senate, but unfortunately there's no district yet, and we know why that is, right? So hopefully he'll be able to know what district he's running in shortly. So please welcome to the stage Andrew Corge.
Good evening. My name is Andrew Corge. I am a member of the Obama generation, and as you just heard, a candidate for state senate somewhere in South Florida. Our legislature is so dysfunctional at the moment that we don't even have a state senate map. So anyhow, I have the privilege of being here tonight to introduce David Axelrod, and I'm going to say a lot of great things about him for 2 reasons. One, he's earned all the praise that he's going to get from me and others, and Two, I figured I'd get some free political advice. So on that note, David Axelrod is an American political consultant and director of the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago. Axelrod, or Axe as they call him, was a top political advisor to President Bill Clinton and was President Barack Obama's chief campaign advisor during his presidential campaigns of 2008 and 2012. Axelrod also served as the president's senior advisor. In Believer, My 40 Years in Politics, the legendary strategist shares a wealth of stories from the journey through the inner workings of American democracy. A story of corruption and transformation, turmoil and progress. Believer takes readers behind the closed doors of politics, even as it offers a thrilling call to democratic action. In her praise of the books, Doris Kearns Goodwin writes, "Beautifully written with warmth, humor, and remarkable self-awareness, Believer is one of the finest political memoirs I have ever read. David Axelrod's Believer is a powerful and inspiring memoir enlivened by the charm and candor of one of the greatest political strategists in American history. And frankly, I hope it inspires my generation to get more active, not just in a presidential election, but in off-year elections, because that's what we need right here, right now." Thank you. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, David the Axe Axelrod. At some point, whatever you... Thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Can you guys hear me? Is this... So I have to apologize because they wanted me to stand at this podium. And so as long as we're in the spirit of memoirs, I have to tell you that I was a hyperactive kid before anyone knew what a hyperactive kid was. When I was back in the 4th grade, my teacher, Mrs. Langdale, called my mother and said, "Your boy has a lot of energy," she said. "So as long as he gets his work done, I think I'm going to let him pace in the back of the classroom every now and then, just to burn some of that off." That's by way of explaining that I'm going to walk instead of stand behind this podium. I'm really pleased to be here in this land of aspiring presidents, Miami. And I'm honored to be at Miami-Dade. You know, we talked a lot in the White House about community colleges, which are the kind of hidden treasure of the American education system, and they're more important than ever because of the cost of higher education. And what Dr. Padron has done here, what this community has done, is truly remarkable. Anytime we talked about community colleges, Miami-Dade was sort of the gold standard by which we measured community colleges. So, of course, it's great to be part of this incredible book festival. When you're writing a book, even before you get done with the book, you think, "Gee, I'd love to go down to there," because there are some great readers down there. And this is a great institution. It's at a time when, you know, I think reading is getting undervalued, you know, and this is not anything against Snapchat or Twitter or anything else, but books are good. And I'm so glad that you guys appreciate books. So it is unusual to be able to name the exact time and place where a lifelong passion began, but I can do that. And it was October 27th, 1960. John F. Kennedy was campaigning in New York City 12 days before the 1960 election. It tells you how long ago that was, because he was a Democrat and he made 10 stops in New York City because New York State was in doubt in 1960 in his race against Richard Nixon. And in the middle of the afternoon, he came to Stuyvesant Town, where I grew up. I don't know, maybe is anybody, are you guys familiar with Stuyvesant Town? Yeah. It was built for returning war veterans after World War II, a housing development, a forest of red brick buildings. And the woman who took care of me when my mother was at work, this splendid African-American woman named Jessie Berry, who had kind of the classic story. She'd come up in the Great Migration very little formal education and a lot of wisdom. And she took care of other people's children so she could take care of her own. And she really helped raise me in many ways. And she thought I should see this. And she said, we're going to go out there. And she took me out to 20th Street in Stuyvesant Town. And it's a huge boulevard that sort of bisected the place. And it was always filled with cars, but now it was filled with people. And she put me on top of a mailbox to watch this. And this very energetic man with red hair jumped up on this platform and started speaking about America and the future. And his voice was booming off of all the buildings, and everyone was paying rapt attention. And even though I was 5, it was clear that this was very important. It seemed very exciting to me. And I can't pretend. I mean, I was precocious, but not that precocious. I can't say I remember everything he said that day. But through the wonders of Google, which none of us could have imagined that day, I went back and I looked at the remarks he made. And I have to tell you that I had the honor of speaking at the John F. Kennedy Library about my book, and they presented me with a copy of his notes from that day, which is a really wonderful gift. But part of what he said was, I'm not running on the platform that says, if you elect me, everything will be easy. He said, being an American citizen in the 1960s is a hazardous occupation filled with peril, but also hope. And we'll decide in this election which path we take. And in a sense, that's what I believe about politics. Politics is the way we grab the wheel of history and steer it, and set the right course for the future. Robert Kennedy, his brother, said it even more succinctly, and you'll see it's the epigram in my book. He said, the future is not a gift, it's an achievement. And politics is the way we achieve the future. And so I was hooked from that moment on. And I actually started working in campaigns as a little boy. When I was 9 years old, I worked for Bobby Kennedy when he came to New York and ran for the Senate. I wasn't the strategist in that campaign. I was a little field guy, giving out leaflets. And then the next year, some of you may remember this fella, I actually had I made a momentous decision, and I broke with the Democratic Party. Tough when you're 10 to... But I felt like they were running a hack for mayor of New York City. And there was a guy who was our local congressman who was a Republican named John Lindsay, who also was running on the Liberal Party. John Lindsay was a liberal Republican. And if you must have like a Museum of Natural History here. I think they have some of those on display. But he was very much a person who believed that through government that you could make a real difference in the life of a community. And he was very much in that Kennedy tradition, ultimately ended up as a Democrat. In fact, he was hoping, now that I remember, he was hoping that the Florida primary would be his ticket to the Democratic nomination in 1972. I don't know how many of you were around here, but you disappointed him. And he quit after the Florida primary. And throughout my childhood, I worked on campaigns, and in 1968 I was involved with Kennedy again in that fateful election that ended in his death. But I was consumed by this, and when it came time to to choose a college, I chose the University of Chicago, and I chose the University of Chicago for 3 reasons. The first was I knew it was an excellent school. The second was it was more than 600 miles from New York, so I knew my parents wouldn't surprise me with a visit. And the third But the third reason was that Chicago was such an interesting political town. It was the home of the last of the big city machines. Mayor Richard J. Daley was still sitting atop his empire there. It was also, there were also the beginnings of a very powerful black independent political movement, and it was, bless you, it was, that was centered around the University of Chicago. It was kind of a hub of it, and I thought this was really interesting. Of course, Chicago had been home to that sort of cataclysmic and very momentous '68 Democratic Convention. So I was really attracted to Chicago. But the problem is, though, when I get to the University of Chicago, what I discovered was that nobody wanted to talk about anything that happened after the year 1800. And so, in order to satisfy my interest in politics, I started writing. My mother had been a journalist. She always told my sister and me that she named us because she thought our names would look good in bylines. So much for self-determination. But I started writing, stringing for newspapers, writing wherever I could. I went back to New York in the summer of 1973, and I knocked on 75 doors of different publications and news organizations until I found one that was so down on its luck that they were willing to hire a guy with very little experience. And they did, and the Villager newspaper in Greenwich Village, if any of you remember. And they gave me a great opportunity, and I stayed an extra quarter there to work on the paper. And when I went back to Chicago, I walked into the offices of the Hyde Park Herald, which is a newspaper that serves the community in which the University of Chicago sits. And it just so happened, like the day I walked in, they had a political columnist who had quit because he was going to work for the state attorney general. And the publisher looked at me and he said, "So you say you know something about politics?" I said, "Oh yes, I know a lot about politics." He said, I was 18. And he said, you think you can write this column? And I said, I know I can write this column. And improbably and probably insanely, he and I both marched forward in this pact for me to write this column. By the way, when I was writing the book, I looked back at my first column for the Hyde Park Herald, and it was about Mayor Daley and the local congressman who was named Ralph Metcalf, and who had been an African-American lieutenant of Daley's for years, but now had broken with him over the issue of police brutality. And it was all about the issue of the relationship between the police and the black community and lack of oversight and so on. So that was 43 years ago. Thank God we got that taken care of. I was able to develop a body of, I became sort of an expert on all the wards of the 50 wards of Chicago and the ward committeemen and the city council member, the aldermen, and all the Byzantine history, and the history was often Byzantine. And I was able to parlay that into an internship at the Chicago Tribune and that into a job. And the city editor was a great sort of old front page type character named Bernie Judge, who had a sign on his office door that said, "If your mother says she loves you, check it out." I mean, he was a real newsman. And he became a mentor to me, and the newsroom really became a family. My father, who by the way was, I feel like it's important to mention this given what we're seeing right now. My father was an immigrant. He really was a refugee from, during the pogroms, came over here, fled violence and persecution, and America opened its arms to him, for which I'm grateful. And it's why I find this whole debate so painful right now, because I think it's what makes this country so great. But but I was very much alone after he died when I was 19, and we were very close, and I was very much alone after that. And the newsroom became my home, my family, and the editors became my mentors, and it was a wonderful experience. And this guy, Bernie Judge, said to me, I know you know more about Chicago politics than anybody I've got. He said, but you don't know how to be a reporter yet. He said, so you're going to go on nights for a while to learn that. And it turned out to be an incredible experience. 2.5 years on nights at the Chicago Tribune, you know, covering murder and mayhem, which turned out to be great preparation for covering Chicago politics. And they used to take me off of nights every once in a while just to satisfy my desire to cover politics, and they'd put me on whoever they thought was going to lose, you know, like during a campaign for a few weeks. And in 1979, they assigned me to this woman, Jane Byrne, and they said, you know, she's got no chance, but she's interesting. And of course, it's snowed for 40 days. I don't know if there are any Chicagoans here who remember this, but it snowed, it was biblical, really. It snowed for 40 straight days. The city did a very poor job. Daley was gone now and his successor was there, but the organization was still in place. They did such a poor job of cleaning the streets and getting public transit going that Jane Byrne was swept into office. One sidelight to that, by the way, is that one of the things that they did was they were running express trains during the snows from downtown to the suburbs, and they completely bypassed the African-American communities on the west side and the south side. African-American voters who were the most reliable vote for the Democratic organization, gave Jane Byrne a 2-to-1 victory, and that was the margin by which she got elected. And then she had been a product of the machine. She was a protege of Richard J. Daley, but then she ran this very flamboyant and very vigorous reform campaign to win. And then when she became mayor, she became kind of a parody of an old machine mayor, made deals with the mob who were very politically active in some of Chicago's wards. And it was a disastrous run. But the thing that she did that was most egregious was she really turned on the black community. She threw a number of black leaders off of the housing board and made a series of decisions that were really an affront to the community that had helped elect her. So it gave rise to, in 1983, to the election of Harold Washington as the first African-American mayor of Chicago. More on him a little bit later. But I was a City Hall bureau chief at the time, and it was that story I wrote is still encased in stone in this gallery in the lobby of the Chicago Tribune, though they just announced they're selling the building. So if you want to see it, get there quick. So I loved being a reporter, but after about 6 years, there were real changes at the newspaper. They brought in a different management team that wanted to squeeze more margin out of the paper. It was kind of a precursor of what was to come. All of my favorite editors were kind of squeezed out, people who thought the story was the most important thing, and the kind of encouragement that I got wasn't really there anymore. And over time, I became kind of disillusioned about the path the paper was on. And in 1984, a fellow who some of you may remember approached me more than once, like for a year, to come work for him, named Paul Simon, not the singer. Also a great guy, but... Paul Simon was, you talk about an authentic person and a believer. Paul Simon was all of that. You know, for those of you who don't know him, he was sort of the Orville Redenbacher of Illinois politics. He had a bow tie and horn-rimmed glasses. He wore these ill-fitting suits that were like 5 inches too short, and I finally ascertain that these were bequeathed to him by a constituent who had died, and he just never got them altered. But Paul, when he was 19 years old, quit college and bought a newspaper in southern Illinois, deep southern Illinois, which is really the rural South. And he used this newspaper to campaign against a crime syndicate down there, and tried to get people to run against them. And when they wouldn't, he ran for the legislature in his early 20s and got elected to the Illinois legislature. And he went to the legislature and he fought for reform, which it's hard in Illinois now, but it was even harder in the 1950s. But more than that, he fought for civil rights from a district that was, as I mentioned, closer to Little Rock than Chicago. And I really admired him for it. And I thought if I was going to make the move from journalism to politics, I wanted to make it with someone who I knew would make me proud. And so I went to work for Paul. He was running against Charles Percy, who was a 3-term Republican incumbent who once was a very moderate Republican but had shifted to try and deal with the Reagan drift of the Republican Party. And he was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, very powerful. And we ended up winning that race. Ronald Reagan carried our state by 500,000 votes, and Paul Simon won by 88,000 votes. And he got 25% of the vote from people, from self-described conservatives, not because they agreed with him on much, but because they respected him for being honorable and for telling the truth and not trimming his sails and being a man of character. So it was a great, great victory. And on that basis, I started a consulting practice, doing campaigns, making ads. Started with little, small campaigns and leveraged my way up to larger campaigns and became the most successful. We became the most successful firm between the coasts doing campaigns. And by the way, I always liked being between the coasts because I thought I was a better political strategist because I lived in a place where people didn't talk about the Federal Register over dinner, you know. And I actually, that was reinforced to me when I was working in the White House, which is really, it's an incredibly energizing place to work. But you also feel like you're looking at America through a periscope. And it was valuable for me to live in the center of the country and hear and feel what people were hearing and feeling. And so we had a great run. We did races at every level. But by 2001, 2002, I started getting very uncomfortable with the direction of the I guess business that I was in, partly because I never really thought about it as a business. I mean, it was a great way to make a living because I thought I could do well and do good. But the level of cynicism I felt welling up was really discomforting to me. And one of the precipitating factors had to do with another guy who I'd worked for, whose name may be familiar to you, named Rod Blagojevich. I think I deserve some character points for acknowledging that. But the truth is, Rod was a very feisty guy who I thought had good, he was the son of an immigrant, good working class sensibilities. And when he was a state legislator, he asked for my help in running for Congress, and I helped him to run for Congress. But then he approached me in 2000. And by the way, and I need to say this, I had a son who had significant issues with depression when he was younger, and he went and he spent 3 summers as an intern in Blagojevich's congressional office, and Rod was incredibly kind to him. So, I'd feel bad if I didn't note that. But when he came to me in 2001 and said he wanted to run for governor of Illinois, I was a little bit taken aback, and I said, well, why? And he said, well, you can help me figure that out. And I said, look, if I have to help you figure out why you should run, then you shouldn't run. That was the end of our relationship. But by the summer of 2002, he had hired a very good consulting firm, state-of-the-art firm. They did all the, the by-the-book things. They took their polling and they fitted him to the profile of the candidate they thought he needed to be. In this case, a reformer, which seems ironic now. But our last governor was also on his way to prison, so not painting a great picture of the land of Lincoln here. But so I was, by the summer of 2002, he was like running rings around his Republican opponent, who was this very, I thought, honorable, conservative Republican attorney general. And it was clear he was going to win. And I really started thinking about how much longer I wanted to do campaign work. And just at that time, I got a call from a friend of mine named Barack Obama. And he was going through his own existential crisis because in 2000 he had run for Congress. He was a splendid state senator, and after 4 years he decided to challenge an incumbent congressman in a primary, and he lost narrowly by 30 points. And his political stock was diminished, and he was broke and in debt. And he called me and he said, I have one race left in me, and if it doesn't work, I promise Michelle, it's up or out. I'll go and make a living. And I'm thinking of running for the U.S. Senate. Now, I should tell you how I met him. In 1992, he had just returned from Harvard Law School, and he was running a voter registration drive. I got a call from a woman named Betty Lou Saltzman, who's kind of a doyen of liberal politics in Chicago, and she said, I just met the most remarkable young man, and I think you ought to meet him too. And I said, I'm happy to meet anybody you want, but why? She said, I think he could be the first African-American president of the United States. So now when I go to the track, I take Betty Lou with me. She obviously has a gift. And I went and I had lunch with Obama, and he was in every way impressive. I didn't leave, as I wrote in the book, humming "Hail to the Chief." But what was clear was that he was a really admirable guy. The world of politics basically divides into two categories. There are people who run for office, and this is the more numerous category, because they want to be something. And then there's this smaller and more admirable cohort of people who run for office because they want to do something, who think of politics as a calling and not as a business or an exercise in self-aggrandizement. And he was clearly that kind of guy. He had just come back from Harvard, where he was president of the Harvard Law Review. He could have written, the first African-American president of the Harvard Law Review, could have written his ticket at any corporation or law firm in America. And instead he returned to Chicago to run this voter registration drive, and he took a job in a small firm practicing civil rights law and employment law, representing, people who had been screwed, basically, and for very little money. And as he talked about what he wanted to do in the future, and his interest in running for public office someday, it was clear to me that he saw this as an opportunity. He had been this community organizer. He saw this as an opportunity to help people, to make communities stronger. And I really liked him, and I admired him. But he didn't need my help in his earlier elections, and I couldn't give him help in that congressional race for reasons that are too involved here. But basically, I had worked for Richard M. Daley, the mayor's son, and Richard M. Daley had a race for mayor against Bobby Rush, who was the guy who Obama had challenged right before that congressional race. And it would have looked like retribution if I had been involved in that race. So I told him I couldn't help him in that race, and I gave him recommendations for others. When he called in 2002, he was in no way a star of Illinois politics. He had just lost that race. he was like a third-tier candidate for the U.S. Senate. There were candidates who were running, one very well-known statewide official, well-liked statewide official. There was a very wealthy candidate who ended up spending $30 million of his own on this Senate race, which I don't know, that may be, I don't know, in this state that may sound like chump change after. Back then it was a lot of money though. And he was a black guy named Barack Obama. And remember, this was 1 year after a guy with a similar sounding name attacked America. And so there was a lot of skepticism about whether Barack could pull this off. But for me, it was like a tonic. For me, it was such a great opportunity. And I said to my wife, Susan, you know, if I could help Barack get elected to the United States Senate, that would be something I could be proud of for the rest of my life. And he was a splendid guy. There was no African Americans in the United States Senate at the time. But for the longest time, we didn't know whether he'd even get the chance. There had been an African American candidate, senator in the United States Senate, and she was from Illinois, Carol Moseley Braun, and she was defeated. And now she was thinking about making another race for it, though her numbers in the general election were very poor. Had she decided to run, he wouldn't have been able to run. And you know, my job was to try and persuade people that I had a little cachet in the state and to persuade people that he could win. And we ended up having the most splendid campaign. It was really a forerunner of what you saw in 2008. It was inspiring and uplifting. And I learned a lot about him through that process. Early in the race, he was down in southern Illinois, close to where Paul was from, Simon, and he was at a VFW hall in a little town. And I got a call from a young man who traveled with him, and he said, "We just had a great day." And I was like, "Really? That's shocking." And when I expressed that to Obama, when he called me that night, he said, "Why are you so surprised?" I said, "I don't know, a black guy named Barack Obama in rural southern Illinois. I thought it might be challenging." He said, "No, you don't understand." He said, "These people, they're just like my grandparents from Kansas." And we start talking about, my grandfather in Patton's Army and my grandmother, Rosie the Riveter, and we have a good time. And I realized this is a guy who felt comfortable in any room in which he walked, whether it was a VFW hall in southern Illinois or an inner city church or a Tony parlor in the suburbs. And at a time when we were so riven, to have a guy who could cross those lines so genuinely was really a gift. The second thing I learned about him early on was in October of 2002, the Senate was voting on the resolution authorizing the war in Iraq. And, it's hard to remember now, but it was very popular. And almost every candidate on both sides of our Senate race, there was an incumbent who ultimately didn't run, incumbent Republican, but all the Democrats, major Democrats, were for the resolution. And the same Betty Lou called and said, "We're having an anti-war rally outside the federal building, and we'd like you to speak." And we had a little call about it, and there was a lot of discussion about the merits or demerits of doing it. There were some people, I will excuse myself, it wasn't me, arguing that he shouldn't go. And finally, Barack said, "You know what, here's the thing. I think this is a terrible idea, and I think I should go and say so." And he went and he made the speech. My wife and son were there. I wasn't there. If I had known how historic this speech was going to be, I would have had a film crew there. When he ran for president, I scoured high and low to try and find footage of it. There were news organizations there. There was only 14 seconds left that were preserved of his speech, but you can find the text also on Google. And what he said at that time was, I fear a war of undetermined length, undetermined cost, and undetermined consequences. I fear that we're going to release sectarian strife in Iraq that we can't control. I feel like we're going to make America more of a target for extremism. And every single one of those concerns has proven out, and we're still living with the consequences of that tragic decision today. He was a state senator from Illinois. He didn't have most members of the Illinois State Senate, I don't know how it is in Florida, don't have a foreign policy staff. And he certainly didn't. But he came to this conclusion on his own. And then the third revelation was, well, before I get to the third revelation, I should say, before we won that primary, we ended up winning that primary, going away, shocking everyone. We did our first ad, and in it he talked about the things that he had overcome in his life, and he finished by saying, now they say we can't change Washington. Well, I'm Barack Obama, and I approve this message to say, yes, we can. And I wrote that line, and I loved that line because it was inclusive. It was about we and not him. It was positive at a time when people so desperately wanted a positive message, and it was one that he believed. And but when we went to film the ad, he did the first take, and when he got to the end, he said, "Yes, we can." Yes. He says, "Is that too corny?" And my heart stopped, you know. And I made this vigorous case for why it wasn't too corny. I don't know. He said, and Michelle was sitting on the steps watching. She wanted to see him do his first ad. She was sitting on the steps of this house in which we were in, just with her hand on her chin. And he said, "Mish, what do you think?" And she just shook her head, "Not corny." He said, "Great, let's go." So I knew what my advice was worth. But thank God she was there. Years later, I saw someone in Tahrir Square holding up a sign saying, "Yes, we can too." And I thought, what if she had said it was corny? That guy wouldn't have had anything for his sign, you know. So, but the third thing I learned, the third revelation from that campaign, we won the primary, I mentioned, by a large margin. And one of the great things about it was that we won areas that African-American candidate had never won before. We won virtually the whole northwest side of Chicago, where Harold Washington had gotten like 2% of the vote. We won a precinct in which Harold Washington had campaigned 20 years earlier for mayor with Walter Mondale, who was the putative nominee of the Democratic Party for president. And they were greeted by crowds that were so ugly and so vicious that it was a national story. And I looked up that precinct the night we won the primary, and Obama had carried that precinct. And I said to him, "Harold's smiling down on us tonight." But the last revelation came when we campaigned hard to get him the keynote speech at the Democratic National Convention. I mean, you like to sort of humbly say, "No, that just came to us." But we really worked hard to persuade them that he would be the right guy. And John Kerry had seen him speak after the primary at an event, and he was very taken by him. So they called us in Southern Illinois one night when we were driving around, and Mary Beth Cahill, Kerry's manager, said, "We'd like you to give the keynote speech." And after the call got dropped several times because cell service wasn't very good down there, Obama said yes, and he hung up the phone. He said, "I know what I want to say." And I said, "Really, what do you want to say?" He says, "I want to talk about my story as part of the larger American story." And in the following weeks, he wrote this speech, in the car when he was campaigning, in the men's room at the state senate, in between votes, on little scraps of paper, and then he pulled it all together. I was on a one-week vacation, and I remember being with my wife, and I was overseas, and they faxed this speech that had been emailed into the office at 1 in the morning, which is when he generally does his work on these things. And I read the first page and the second page. By the third page, I thought this is going to be one of the great convention speeches of all time. And I was on the floor of I don't know if any of you were at that speech in Boston, but it was a phenomenal experience to be on the floor of the Fleet Center in Boston and watch him give this speech, because there was the usual murmur of disinterest at the beginning, but pretty quickly people were totally engaged, and then they were crying, and then all those Obama signs that we had distributed, people were actually holding up in the hall. And I was standing there with Robert Gibbs, our press secretary, and I said, this guy's life has just changed forever. and I think maybe ours have too, because I was in the audience in 1984 when Mario Cuomo made his convention speech in San Francisco, and I knew how, that he was immediately projected into the national thinking, and we knew that Obama would be too. Things changed overnight. Never expected at that moment, and really up until the end of 2006, that he would actually be a candidate in 2008. Never expected that. But events, it wasn't quite like the convention speech. We did throw a few logs on the fire along the way, I confess. But events really conspired to draw him into that race. He was the right guy at the right time, and he ran. And I'm not going to rehearse. I could tell you innumerable stories about that campaign, but you're all familiar with it. I will tell you one though, and that was the story about the speech he gave on race in Philadelphia that some of you may remember after this very, very threatening story surfaced about his pastor, Reverend Wright, and some of the hateful things that Reverend Wright had said, and divisive things that Reverend Wright had said. And a lot of the news media, and a lot of the political community never really believed that America was ready to elect a black man. And so there was this sense that maybe this was it. Maybe this was the moment when the whole thing collapsed. This was in the spring of 2008. He had been in the Senate all day making on a series of votes, so he was kind of insulated from the furor. But when he got back to Chicago, he did a couple of cable interviews, and he got a taste of how intense the feelings were about this. And he called me up that night, and David Plouffe, and he said, our manager, and he said, I want to give a speech on race in America. And he had wanted to do that for some time, and we had discouraged it. We didn't think strategically it was the right thing to do. But now it wasn't a discussion, it was, we're doing it. And he said, and I want to do it, this was Friday night, I want to do it no later than Tuesday morning. And he says, and I have to write it. And I said, well, you're campaigning all day tomorrow, we're filming commercials on Sunday, and then you're campaigning all day in Pennsylvania on Monday because of the Pennsylvania primary, so when are you going to write this speech? He said, don't worry about it, I know what I want to say, just set it up. So we set it up for the Constitution Center in Philadelphia on the theory that if you're going to go down on a big stage. Saturday night he dictated an outline to his speechwriter, John Favreau, who sent something back. Then he started working in earnest on this speech Sunday night after he put his kids to bed. The speech is, remember, Tuesday morning. It's half done when we set out for Pennsylvania at 8:30 that morning. He worked till 3 in the morning. We left at 8:30 in the morning. He campaigned till 9 at night. We arrived at the hotel in Philadelphia, which was filled with reporters basically circling like buzzards, thinking this could be it for him. We arrived at the hotel. He went off to his room to write. I went off to the bar to drink because it seemed there's nothing else to do but worry and drink. And I went to my room and I went to sleep, and I woke up at about 2 in the morning, and there was the speech. And I stood there in the dark, scrolling down my BlackBerry, which was a device we used to use in those days. And it was such a powerful, honest statement that I emailed him back and I said, this is why you should be president. And the next morning, we were in the green room, and a lot of his friends were in the first few rows and really tense, and the room was just filled with tension. And he was calm, and he said, look, I know everybody's nervous, he said, but I'm going to go out there and make that speech, and either people will accept it or they won't, and if they don't, then I won't be president. He said, but at least I'll have said what needs to be said. And he said, and that's worth something. And he went out there, and of course, the rest is history. It was a very maybe the most powerful statement on race any candidate has ever made. You guys know the rest of the story on the campaign. We had that wonderful night in Grant Park. moving, incredible night in Grant Park. 6 weeks later, we are at the Federal Building, just 4 blocks from the Grant Park, in the transition headquarters, and now we're getting a report from his Council of Economic Advisors on all of his economic advisors, actually, on the problem with the economy. Christy Romer was the incoming director of the Council of Economic Advisors, and an expert on the Great Depression said, this is going to be the deepest recession since the Great Depression. She had lots of charts, and that was her bottom line. Larry Summers said, we've lost millions of jobs, and we're going to lose millions of more. And he said, Mr. President, first time I heard people referring to him as that, which was sort of jarring. He said, Mr. President, we could see a second Great Depression here. Tim Geithner, the incoming Treasury Secretary, said the banks are locked up. The financial system is very fragile, could collapse. And then to cheer everybody up, the budget director, Peter Orszag, said, and this is going to add trillions of dollars, this is going to balloon our deficits, add trillions of dollars in debt. And everybody kind of looked at Obama to see how he was going to process all of this. And he thought about it for a second and said, well, I guess it's too late to ask for a recount. He said, so we better figure out what we're going to do. And in that room was born the Recovery Act, much maligned, but as I think history will record it as an incredibly impactful program and necessary. But he had to make a series of decisions in the next few months, each of which were as unpopular as they were necessary. That one, because Americans were very nervous, not just about the economy, but about deficits. And so adding $800 billion in spending was not very popular. Certainly, standing up the financial system wasn't very popular. Everybody was enraged by what had happened on Wall Street, and now we were, in their view, bailing them out, and nobody felt like they were getting a bailout. And it was very, very difficult and wrenching, but necessary. And then the third was, everybody now thinks that it was a no-brainer to save the American auto industry, to intervene to do that. But that was very unpopular. In fact, in the meeting, we had a 2-hour meeting on this, at which he made his final decision with his auto task force. And, I had a report that even in the state of Michigan, people didn't want us to intervene. Because there, too, they felt like the automakers had made mistakes for decades, so why should American taxpayers bail them out? But as he pointed out, if we're in this terrible recession, and if Chrysler and GM go down and all the supply chains behind them, we're going to lose 1 million jobs. And so we had a 50-50 shot to save them, and he took the shot. And as the auto industry has come roaring back, new plants, new shifts, and it was an important, fateful decision, but not a great political decision at the time. But in each and every case, he did what he thought the country required, his responsibility required. Another, and I want to get to questions, but let me just finish with the other big decision that he made when I was there, and that was the decision to go forward with health care. And there was a significant debate. So you know about this. So I guess this is akin to the Blagojevich admission. I was his political advisor, and I was very, very nervous about doing it. And the thing that made it so difficult for me is that I personally understood why we needed to do health reform. I have a child who is 34 years old now. When she was 7 months old, we found her blue and limp in her crib, my daughter Lauren. We thought she had died. We took her to the hospital. We saw her have a grand mal seizure. They said, well, it's probably due to a fever. She had a cold, and she'll be okay in a couple of days. A month later, they released us, and she was still having 10 seizures a day. And this went on for almost 19 years of her life. But at the beginning, when they were trying to find medications that would work, treatments that would work, my insurance didn't cover a lot of that, didn't cover medications for one thing, and we were paying $1,000 a month out of pocket for her treatment, and I was making $38,000 a year as a reporter. And I thought, well, let's get different insurance, and then I discovered that if you have a pre-existing condition, you can't get insurance. So I knew how badly we needed reform, and yet I knew 7 presidents had tried to do it, 7 presidents had failed. I was very fluent in the polling, and I knew how difficult it was. Difficult primarily because 85% of Americans had health coverage, and they viewed health reform as a social welfare program to help the 15% who didn't, when in fact it strengthened everybody by doing away with the prohibition on pre-existing conditions, by doing away with lifetime caps and so on. But it was an incredibly difficult and fraught issue. The president said, I get this, but if we don't act in the first 2 years, we'll probably not get it done. And if we don't get it done, tens of millions of more people will lose their health care. We're going to continue to have this inflation in health care costs. It's going to impact on the government, it's going to impact on businesses, and it's going to impact on families. He said, what are we supposed to do, put our approval rating on the shelf and admire it for 8 years? Or are we supposed to draw down on it? To do things for the country. And every time, and believe me, health reform died 1,000 deaths before it became a reality. And there were so many people in Washington who wanted him to give up. And even in our own councils, there were people who wanted him to give up. I went into his office in the summer of 2009, and again, I had polling data, and I wasn't trying to get him to once he was in, I was in. But I told him, we're taking on some water here. And I went through all the polling. We were standing in the middle of his office. And he said, yeah, but I just got back from Wisconsin, Green Bay, Wisconsin, and I was with a 36-year-old woman, married. She has 2 children. They have insurance. They have jobs. But now she has stage 4 breast cancer, and she's hit her lifetime caps. And she's just terrified that she's going to die and leave her family bankrupt. Now I feel his hand in the small of my back leading me out of his office. We get to the door, and he says, that's not the country we believe in, so let's keep fighting. A few weeks later, we had a meeting at which some people tried to persuade him to give up, and he turned to Phil Shalero, his legislative director, and he said, Phil, what do you think the chances of passing this are? And Shalero said, it depends how lucky you feel, Mr. President. Which isn't necessarily what you want to hear, but, and Obama said, Phil, he said, I'm a black guy named Barack Obama, and I'm President of the United States. He said, I feel lucky every day. So, just to fast forward to the end of that story, on March 23rd, 2010, the House voted on health reform, and we all were gathered in the Roosevelt Room next to his office, the conference room next to his office, and my office was right next to his office. President, vice president, everybody who worked on the issue. And, we were exhilarated. But I found myself getting up almost involuntarily and walking out and going to my office, and I closed the door, and I just broke down, and I wept. And I sobbed, and I couldn't understand why at first. I didn't understand my own reaction. And then I realized it was because I remembered what my own family had gone through. And I realized that because of what he had done and what we had done to help him, and frankly, people in this room had done to make it possible for him to do those things, other people weren't going to have to go through what my family went through. They weren't going to know that terror, that fear. And so I went and found him once I composed myself. And I said, I want to thank you on behalf of all those families who won't have to go through what my family went through. And he knows my family well, and he understood what I meant, and he put his hand on my shoulder, and he said, well, that's why we do the work. That's why we do the work. And if there's one story in my whole life, those whole 40 years that crystallized everything, it was that. I know that there's a great deal of cynicism about politics today. I know that there's a great deal of concern about where we're going. But don't let anybody tell you that we still don't have the ability to make a difference in people's lives, and that it's not worth the effort. It is worth the effort. I met a young man a few weeks ago who had a baseball cap on, came up to me on the street, and I noticed he didn't have any hair under that cap, and he had tears in his eyes, and he said, "I just want to thank you." And I said, "For what?" He said, "I think you helped save my life." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "I didn't have health insurance, and I got it through the Affordable Care Act, and I hadn't been feeling well, and I went and saw a doctor, and it turned out that I had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And had I not had this insurance, I don't know that I would have caught it in time." And you know, I wanted the subtitle of my book to be "How My Idealism Survived 40 Years in Politics." And that's why I'm a believer. That my book isn't about belief in a person. It's about a belief in our ability together to do big things, to solve problems, to make this a better country. And I hope that when you walk away from my book, you'll get that sense. And with that, I want to thank you for listening to my story. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you so much.
Hello.
I spoke way too long, so I don't want to. Let's take some
We'll take
questions.
a few questions. Okay.
Yes.
Mr. Axelrod,
Yes.
Hillary Clinton supported Bush's war in 2003 and voted for it, and President Obama very courageously was against that war. So it seems that
That's been well discussed.
it seems his first choice for Secretary of State possibly might not have been Hillary Clinton. Can you talk about what kind of pressure the Clintons might have put on President Obama? And secondly, on 60 Minutes, President Obama seemed to, even regardless of the FBI investigation into the email matter, President Obama publicly seemed to cover for, or at least defend her status in that. Do you think, regardless of what the FBI may recommend, that the fix is already in, that it'll just die and never go to grand jury?
So you wouldn't be a Bernie Sanders supporter, would you? I'll tell you, when he chose her for Secretary of State, I was surprised, not because of that. Remember, he spoke at a Democratic convention for a nominee who had also voted for that war, John Kerry. The vice presidential nominee, John Edwards, had also voted for that war. The president was looking forward and not back, and he knew that he himself would set the policy. But the reason that he chose her was that he also knew we were going to be dealing with a monstrous economic crisis. And he said, I need a Secretary of State who will be instantly recognized as an A-team player when she lands on the ground. And she has that stature. And he said, and I believe we were friends before the election. We'll be friends in the future. And if she's on the team, I think she'll be a loyal member of that team. And she was. And I for the 2 years I was there, they had, I thought, an extraordinarily respectful and positive relationship. As to the email question, I think she said, and I couldn't agree more, that it was a dumb thing to do. But I also think that, you know, when all of this combing gets done, it's highly likely that it's going to be a dumb thing and not much more. I mean, there are a lot of people with an interest in keeping that story alive. I think we saw about a whole bunch of them on that Benghazi committee. And I think she did very well there. You know, I think Hillary Clinton's going to be the nominee of the Democratic Party. And I think that given what we've seen on the Republican side, she's got a very, if you were to standing here today, you'd say she is the most likely person to be the next president of the United States.
Mr. Axelrod, thank you, first of all, for sharing your storied political career with us.
Thank you. Thanks for listening.
It was a pleasure. I have two questions. The first relates to the President's criticism of the President, of his inability to adequately share his message, what he wants to say with the American people. As a political strategist, my first question is, can you comment on why you think the President has had such a significant poor effort in convincing the American public, and especially American Jews, that by any objective metric, he is probably the strongest supporter of Israel since Harry Truman? Can you comment on why you think there's been that problem? And the second question I have relates to your present position as talking head on CNN, and I'd like to know your opinion as to the partisanship or lack of partisanship of CNN News.
Well, you know, you may be a reporter because you just asked two questions that were completely unrelated and tried to pass it off as one. You know, I've puzzled a lot about this question because you know, as I said, Barack Obama's not just a guy I work for, but he's been a friend of mine for 20 years. And I also know a lot of his other friends, you know, people like Abner Mikva and Newton Minow, who are like real mentors to him. I know what his value system is, and I know what he thinks about Israel and what Israel represents. I also saw him, do everything he could to provide, more than any other president has, a qualitative military edge for Israel. But he does believe strongly that for Israel to survive as a democratic Jewish state, that the Palestinian issue has to be resolved, and it has to be resolved with two states. And this has been a source of, I mean, I know that the Prime Minister has said that this, except before his last election, that this is his position too. But you know, neither the Israeli government nor the Palestinians have done enough. And it seems like both sides have a huge stake in this process. And it's sad to me that you had a president who was willing to risk political capital and do whatever was necessary to support such a process, and we weren't able to do it. And then the second issue is Iran, and there may be dissent or discussion about that issue here. But here's the reality of this. I was with him in the first 2 years of his administration as we traveled the world, and I heard him make the case in every bilateral meeting we were in, including with the Chinese and the Russians, about why it was important, essential to slap these sanctions on Iran, and how disastrous it would be if Iran got a nuclear weapon. And nobody thought that was possible, that we could get those sanctions. No, the world has never seen sanctions as complete and withering as those sanctions were, and it's the reason that Iran came to the table. They struck a deal that will, Iran was within months of developing, completing the development of a weapon. That's been pushed off for a long time now, a decade or more. And the argument now is that, well, you can't relieve the sanctions. And the argument's coming from a lot of people who thought we'd never get sanctions. You can't relieve the sanctions because the sanctions, that then they'll have money to prosecute their nefarious schemes, supporting Hezbollah, supporting Hamas, supporting various acts of terror, and that's a great concern. But here's the truth: if we had walked away from that agreement, or if we hadn't reached one, those sanctions were going to break down, and where we would have been was that Iran would have had their money back, and they would have been months away from a bomb without any kind of intrusive inspections or the kind of withering processes that have now been put in place. I think he did a really great job on this, and I don't think that anyone who cares about Israel should doubt that that was a motivating factor, because he understood what an untethered Iran would mean. And then the last thing, when we were running in 2000, and we got 78% of the Jewish vote in 2008. We got somewhat less, but quite a bit in 2012, despite Sheldon Adelson and a big effort to pry that vote away from him. But there was always this issue. There was a level of suspicion in some elements of the community, and I think some of it had to do with his name, some of it had to do with race, honestly. I hate to say that as a Jew, but I faced it when we went around, and I regret it because I think his values and his concerns and his worldview is so consonant with the values and concerns and worldview of the Jewish community. So anyway, that's an overlong answer, but that's all I got.
Thank you. CNN?
Oh, CNN, yes. I enjoy working for CNN. As you know, I was with MSNBC for 2 years, and I appreciate them. But CNN has afforded me an opportunity to bring to bear the expertise that I gained covering national elections as a reporter, and then participating in them, winning a couple of them. I didn't want to be just a surrogate for the party or our nominee. I wanted to bring to bear my expertise. They've given me the chance to do that, and they've hired a lot of really good political reporters, Jeff Zeleny, who used to be at the New York Times, and a whole bunch of others, and I'm very comfortable there. I'm happy to be there, so I urge you all to watch. Yes?
In your book, you articulate the concept that with regard to presidential and mayoral elections,
Yes.
when incumbents step down,
Yes.
the voters almost always choose change over the status quo. And my question is, with the upcoming 2016 elections looming, I was wondering if you could articulate how you see that playing
Well, let me
out.
explain it. I do have this theory. It has less to do with party than it does to do with personal qualities. I think that in 2008, I wrote a memo that you can read about in the book to Senator Obama, and it articulated this theory that people never choose the replica of what they have. Even if the outgoing incumbent is popular, they almost always choose the remedy, someone who they think will provide some of the qualities they don't think the incumbent has. And Barack Obama was the perfect counterpoint to George W. Bush, who was seen as impulsive and reckless and lacking in deliberation, who saw the world in black and white terms when the world was much more complex. And people wanted a president who saw those nuances and who had the ability to be deliberative and to make decisions where you ask not just what the first step is, but what happens next, which is the question we should have asked, and Obama was asking about Iraq back in 2002. So he was the right man for that time. I think that there's no question that, we tend to swing back and forth, and I think that it may be that people want a little less deliberation, a little less reflection, a little less of the nuance and the gray, and that favors, candidates who are a little less nuanced, and so now Donald Trump may come to mind, but I think generally that is the case. It shouldn't be read as, well, he was a Democrat, so we're going to elect a Republican. I don't think that's necessarily true, and I actually think Hillary's qualities. She is a different person than Barack Obama, and she is a little less nuanced, and she has some of those qualities that people think he lacks, and I think that could favor her in this election. But we'll see. My theory is going to be tested. I think one of the reasons why your former governor is having such a hard time is because he tends to be a little bit, nuanced. And when he talks about issues, I actually admired it when Scott Walker said he would cancel the Iran agreement on the first day, and Bush said, well, I'm going to appoint my cabinet, and I'm going to talk to my allies, which is what, of course, you want a president to do. But sometimes that's not the best answer in a red-hot Republican primary. So You know, in a weird way, he may be too much like Obama to pass muster, particularly on their side of the aisle. Yes, sir.
Welcome to the 32nd Miami Book Fair, Mr. Axelrod.
Yes.
We appreciate your presence. Here's my question.
Yes.
Prior to being
You've
elected,
written it out.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I printed it out. Why not?
I talked so long, you could write your question out.
Pretty much. Prior to being elected, did the administration participate in the intense, unparalleled level of partisanship in Washington? And was it a mistake not trying to get more done the first 2 years when the Dems had?
My
both
goodness, you
control?
know, I think if you look back at what we got done, it's probably, I think it's inarguably the most successful 2 years that any president's had, probably since Lyndon Johnson. You know, from Lilly Ledbetter to the Health Care Act to financial reform to the end of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. There are a whole range of, not to mention the Recovery Act and the steps he had to take to save the economy, winding down those wars. You know, we had 180,000 troops in harm's way when we took office. So I think, but I don't want to dismiss the question, because my great, and I write about this, one of my great regrets is that we didn't change the environment. And you could argue that the environment may be at least as bad or worse in some ways. And do we bear some responsibility for that? We came to office at a time when we were a triage unit trying to save this country from an even deeper economic calamity, and we moved quickly. And you know, the Republicans say, well, you didn't include us. But the truth is, 15 Republicans met on inauguration night, and instead of going to the inaugural ball, they met to talk about, and this has been written about, how they could thwart the president's agenda. They did it in the middle of the biggest economic crisis we've had since the Great Depression. You know, 3 months earlier, Democrats, and Barack Obama led the way, while he was a candidate, rode to the rescue of President Bush on the TARP that nobody liked. Certainly Democrats didn't like it, because the consequence of not doing it would have been the collapse of the economy. And he did it, and Nancy Pelosi did it, and Barney Frank did it, because they thought this was their duty and their responsibility. And we thought maybe we'd get that same kind of cooperation. But the Republicans made a different calculation, and from a strategic standpoint, thoroughly understandable. They had just lost two big elections in 2006 and 2008 badly. We now had control of the House by a wide margin and near control of the Senate. We didn't have quite the 60 votes, but we had close. And their calculation, Mitch McConnell's calculation, he's been very blunt about this, was they own it, let them deal with it. You know, he knew we were going to have to do some really difficult things to deal with the economic crisis that were unpopular. He knew that the economy was not going to mend quickly, and their best chance to win seats in 2010 was not to cooperate with us, but to fight us and then hold us accountable, because the economy that I think they had a lot to do with breaking hadn't recovered fast enough. And, you know, history will say that was a pretty shrewd strategy, you know, as far as politics goes. And I'll let everybody judge whether that was the right strategy from the standpoint of what your patriotic duty require. Thank you. I think maybe we're moving from questions to books. Is that
yes,
what
Mr. Axelrod will be signing books here to the right of the stage. You can purchase your books outside from Books and Books, and then come on in, okay?
Thank you. I hope I didn't go on too long.
No, you did perfect.
Okay, thank you.
You know, I just discovered, I Googled it, over there.